because I will forget otherwise. Thank you. And here's my little introduction. So, hi everyone. My name is Anna Gorilova. Thank you for coming today. I'm the acting president of Appalachian Science Communicators, and we are a group of science communicators in the Appalachian region. We were founded in early 2019, and the purpose of the group is to provide science communication support and camaraderie in a traditionally underserved part of the country. Appalachia in eastern United States referred to a cultural region in the central and southern portions of a mountain range extending from New York to Mississippi. And we encourage members from states with areas touching the Appalachian Range. So from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi to join us. So strictly speaking, most of those states only have portions that are culturally Appalachian. Most of those states also have very active science communication groups. But for our membership purposes, we choose to err on the side of inclusivity. So please come in. We welcome you. Thank you for being here. If you want to join us as a member, the membership fee is only $10 a year, and it gives you free access to all virtual events and discounts for in-person gatherings. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, who are not sure about joining, but appreciate today's event, we ask for a suggested donation of $7 that you can send to our PayPal, which we will put a link to in the chat. And with that, I will pass the mic to Christina Dierkes, who's our host today, and she will introduce our speaker, Matt Shipman. So Christina, take it away.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Beyond the News Release. This session is aimed at discussing ways of highlighting institutional expertise that don't rely on traditional news releases. It is part 2 of our AppSciComm storytelling series, where we ask writers from across the field of science communication to share their expertise with our group. If this is something you're interested in, you can sign up for emails at appscicomm.org. We do not spam, we promise, and you'll be notified when the next webinar is scheduled. As Anna said, my name is Christina Dierkes. I'm part of the organizing committee for AppSciComm, and I work as the editorial lead for the College of Arts and Sciences at Ohio State in Columbus, so one of those border Appalachian states. And our presenter today is Matt Shipman. He's the Assistant Director of Research Communications for North Carolina State University's News Services Office. He spent 10 years as an environmental policy reporter, was a regular contributor to Health News Review, and is the author of the Handbook for Science Public Information Officers, which is sitting on my desk in the office. Otherwise, this is where I would hold that up. He's also currently serves on the board of the National Association of Science Writers. During the session, please make sure, thank you very much, I appreciate it. During the session, please make sure your microphone is muted if you're not speaking. We'll start with a short presentation, and then you're welcome to Zoom, raise your hand, and unmute during the Q&A to ask questions and share your experiences. If you don't want to unmute, you're also welcome to put questions in the chat, and I will read those out once we get to that part. Thank you all for joining us, and Matt, it's all yours.
Hello, everybody. I apologize in advance for coughing or clearing my throat in the middle of the talk because it is allergy season here in North Carolina, and I forgot to take my Zyrtec this morning. I don't know how short this presentation actually is, but I'm going to race through it as quickly as I possibly can because I do want to turn this from me talking at you to us talking with each other. So let's jump right in, okay? Also, I'm going to be putting links to the stories that I mentioned in the chat. Don't worry if you don't open all of them because that seems somewhat frantic. We'll be sending out an email after the fact that has links to all of the examples that I'll be discussing. And also, it's not because I think that my examples are super amazing. I'm an okay writer. I'm not the greatest writer in the universe. It's just that, hey, I know all of the stuff that I wrote, so these were easy examples for me to identify and make use of. All right, so first off, why not just write a news release? So I think news releases are incredibly valuable, but they require you to have a news hook. So whether that's a new discovery or research finding, news releases are what I call internally driven stories. So your institution has done something and you want to push it out. But sometimes you want to take advantage of externally driven stories, right? Where something has happened or is happening out in the world, and you want to contribute to that public conversation in a meaningful way, right? And one of the reasons that I think about this all the time is because highlighting expertise can be really valuable for an institution. But established expertise, even when it's timely, does not always have the news peg that you need to make a news release a viable option. So let's talk about some of the other ways that we can highlight expertise. I'm going to discuss 3 formats. I know I'm going fast, or at least I feel like I'm going fast. Okay, so first off is explainers, right? And explainers are exactly what they sound like. They're relatively concise pieces that explain what something is, how something works, or otherwise answer questions that people have about a specific topic. And explainers have 3 big advantages. So 1, they can often be done quickly, so it's not a huge investment of time, that matters. 2, they lend themselves to search engine optimization. So for example, if you write something like about fruitcake, well, is it going to last forever? You can make the headline, will fruitcake last forever? And you know what? There are people that go to their search engine of choice and they type in, will fruitcake last forever? And guess what they're going to find, right? So SEO is pretty handy for explainers. And third, and this is really important, like it sounds flippant, but it's not. Explainers are usually a lot of fun to write, and it's important to have fun. And if you can have fun at work, you should. So I'm going to give a few examples here. Excuse me while I cut and paste these into the chat. Okay, so this first one is, will fruitcake last forever? That was not a fictional example. Second one is, do insects fart? Like I said, you can have a lot of fun with these. And the third one is, what colors do bees see? We'll be coming back to these examples in a second. All right, so that's one format, the explainer. Second format, the Q&A, right? Questions and answers. These often start with a brief introduction between 1 and 3 paragraphs usually, followed by a conventional Q&A interview format. And these have 4 advantages, right? So 1, they're very quick and easy to write, right? You can knock them out in no time. 2, you don't have to worry about narrative, which is a real time saver, frankly. As long as the questions make sense, one to the next, the narrative takes care of itself. 3, you can work with researchers to help them speak in their own voice. And I think there's real value in that, which we'll be circling back to. What I will often do is send the researchers questions and allow them to write responses on their own time, rather than having it be an actual conversation where I'm taking notes. But what that allows me to do is their voice is in the piece, but we can also ensure that they're communicating clearly and effectively, because I can ask them to explain something more clearly. I can edit it to make sure that, you know, if we use a technical term, that we're defining what that term means and so on, right? And then the fourth advantage to Q&As is that readers intuitively grasp the format. They've all read one of these before, and that means they can easily navigate it and find the information that they want. And here are examples of Q&As. The first one of these examples is actually takes you to a page worth a bunch of Q&As I did between 2020 and 2023, all about different aspects of COVID and vaccines, to help answer some of the many, many questions that I had, that my friends and family had, and that lots of people in the public had. All right, so Q&As and explainers. The third format is features, right? Now, features can take many different forms, but in this context, when we're talking about a feature, we're talking about something that's usually going to focus on an individual. So the feature is about a researcher rather than a finding, or it might be about a body of work rather than a finding. So about a bunch of studies rather than one specific study, right? Features, frankly, I think that they're pretty interesting. You can use it if the researcher themselves is a bit of a character, or there's something that's really compelling about why they got into their field or something like that. And features also are useful when there's some really interesting research findings that you want to write about, but the researcher didn't tell you until way too late for you to do a news release, right? So if they have a paper and you're like, wow, this is amazing, but it came out 4 months ago, you're not going to be able to do a news release. Maybe a feature is the way to go. All right, so the examples for that are here. And I sort of explain with each example why I'm including it, right? So it's about like, the first one is about how this really bizarro team of researchers came together. The second one is great, actually. So it's not about the research. It's about this tool that researchers developed called the barfing machine. I think I used the term vomiting machine in the piece, but it replicates vomit, explosive vomit, and it's as amazing as it sounds. And they even made a little mask for it, so it looks spectacular. And that was about how disease spreads, like how a virus aerosolizes, but in order to replicate that, they needed a barfing machine. And then lastly, it's one of those examples of what I was talking about where a researcher contacted me and they were like, this work is super fantastic. I've published 3 papers on it. That was the warning sign. All 3 papers were at least, I think, 6 months old by the time she told me. So I did a feature bundling all those things together, highlighting why it was interesting or important. All right. So one last note on the formats. These formats are not mutually exclusive, right? So like a lot of Q&As are in fact explainer pieces, for example, right? Okay, now, how do you identify opportunities to highlight expertise, right? Like, how do you figure out what you want to write an explainer about, for example, right? So there are lots of different ways to do this. I'm going to talk about 4 that are pretty straightforward. The first one is definitely easier said than done, but it's probably the most valuable in terms of getting any traction. And that's track current events. You know, read the paper, read magazines, or read whatever the equivalent is of reading the paper online now. What's in the news right now? Are there experts at your institution who could help folks understand what's going on or why it's going on? Can they place this event or these events in context? Can they explain why something happened or what might happen next, right? Those are all really good opportunities. So those COVID Q&As I mentioned are a really good example of something that I came up with, at least in large part, because I was following current events at the time. It was unavoidable. We were all following them. The second sort of way to get ideas is just look at the calendar. What's happening next week? What's happening next month? What's happening 3 months from now, if you need as much lead time as I often do. And usually looking at stuff that's on the calendar can help you think of things to write about, right? So there are going to be holidays coming up. There are going to be sports seasons starting. So like, I know people that are doing something right now on the physics of baseball, right? Like, why does a curveball curve? That sort of thing. It could be about changes in the weather or in seasons or in wildlife behavior that's associated with those things. It could be something like, oh, hunting season starting, right? Like, there's all sorts of stuff. And depending on the type of work that your institution does, there's probably going to be something which is relevant to the researchers that you work with, right? And the fruitcake piece is definitely something that was a calendar-driven piece. I was trying to think of interesting, weird stuff that would be fun to write about close to the winter holidays. And we do a lot of food safety research at NC State, so this was something that came up. I also did one on eggnog and on tamales, so we've got all your bases covered. The third sort of place to get ideas is to just ask your friends, ask your family, right? Like, what do they have questions about? If your institution has specific areas of expertise, make clear like there are boundaries to that. I did this once, and about half the questions I got were medical in nature, right? So while Anna could have potentially answered those with where she works, NC State doesn't have a medical school. So most of those sorts of medically oriented questions, I wasn't able to touch. Same for legal questions. We don't have a law school, right? So I then refined the question that I was asking, right? Do you have any questions about food safety? Do you have any questions about like engineering or infrastructure, that sort of stuff, right? If you worked at a marine science institution, you might say, hey, what do you want to know about sharks or the ocean or tides or whatever, right? All right, the last one, and this one, frankly, is clutch. I love this one. It's my fave. And that is ask kids, particularly little kids, if you have any or know any. And if you don't, that's fine. ask a friend who's a parent, or if you know any teachers, ask them what sort of questions they're hearing from the young people in their lives, right? Because I guarantee there's some doozies, right? So my friend, not a child, asked about like, do bugs fart? So that one we can pin on them. But the first explainer I ever wrote years ago was, what color do bees see? And the reason that I asked that question is because my then 3-year-old daughter asked me, was like reading a book and was like, hey, Dad, what color do bees see? And I was like, what? Like, it never even occurred to me to ask that question. So I asked an entomologist at NC State, and the answer was A, surprisingly fascinating, and B, led to a second question, which was, how do we know? Right? Like, how can you tell what color bees see? And it's the answer to that was also really interesting, right? So if you know any little kids, they are a font of good questions. All right. So there are 4 additional points that apply to all this stuff that we're talking about. And then I will stop talking so rapidly. Right? So one is, basically, it's not enough to just write something, right? If you write something and hope somebody finds it, that's probably not going to work terribly well, because like, I don't think most people go to university news sites looking for explainers about things, right? So to amplify your expertise, it's often useful to use whatever you've written to support pitches, right? You're going to pitch it to reporters or editors who cover the subject matter, right? So if you've written about subject X, figure out who are the reporters or editors who cover subject X, and let them know that you have an expert who may be useful to them when they're covering subject X in the future, right? And you can include a link to whatever you've written as a way of kind of like illustrating the sort of material that your expert can speak to. All right, so that's one important note. The second thing is, if you're highlighting someone's expertise with the goal of getting them out there, right, and making them, to a certain extent, sort of an extension of your institution, right, or a reflection of your institution, then one of the things that is very likely going to happen is that reporters are going to want to talk to them, right? So 2 points here. One, if the expert is unwilling to talk to reporters, you probably don't want to highlight them, right? Because you're essentially inviting reporters to talk to this person, right? And it's not going to do your relationship with reporters any good if they never respond, right? So worth noting. Second thing is that all experts, and generative AI enthusiasts to the contrary, all experts are humans, right? And some humans are jerks. If someone is a jerk, you do not want to make them the centerpiece of whatever that you are doing, right? Because frankly, if they're rude or if they treat people like garbage, you're not going to want to put them in the spotlight, because it's very likely, certainly possible, that they're going to alienate any reporters or anyone else who interacts with them. I've seen this happen. It is not great, right? So, no jerks, basically. I should have just said that. And then a third thing, which is also a reflection of the fact that experts are humans, is that I do not think that we should expect people to leave their lived experiences out when discussing their areas of expertise, right? Because they're not just researchers, right? They're also humans, right? They're also men or women or however they identify. They have like racial and cultural background, religious background. Like, you can't expect those aspects of themselves not to inform what they say and how they say it, right? And we shouldn't expect that of anybody, right? What's more, their lived experiences can often add depth and context to the subjects that they're discussing. For example, there's a expert who I've worked with quite a few times, who's an expert on communications and like technologies. And she's from Brazil, but she's lived in the US for a really, really long time. Her brother still lives in Brazil, and he's also a researcher. And so she and her brother were talking about these differences in how publics in the US and in Brazil were responding to like vaccine or health technologies as they were becoming available during the COVID pandemic, right? What she could bring to the table was informed by her lived experience in both Brazil and the United States. She had insights that people might not have, almost certainly would not have, if they did not have this depth of experience in both places, right? So rather than trying to leave that out and view this like at a complete remove, right, the view from nowhere, she allowed her lived experience to inform what she wanted to talk about. And I think it was really interesting. And so anyway, working with her, that led to getting this piece into Scientific American, which is about the relevant subject, right? So you can make it a strength. It's not something that you want to try and gloss over. Lastly, we just talked about an opinion piece. We should talk about op-eds and first person work, right? I didn't include this in the stuff that I talked about earlier because, this is a writing, session program, and I don't ghostwrite for people, but I do edit for people, and I do help people navigate sort of the op-ed landscape, which can be, frankly, really confusing for a lot of people. So in short, like op-eds are a great way to help you raise the visibility of your experts. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability. And that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. And I did it in 20 minutes or so. So I'm really proud of me. So what, if anything, do folks have questions about?
Yeah, if you want to put questions in the chat, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to kind of Zoom raise your hand and I will call on people. I am selfishly gonna start because I can. With any of the formats that you've talked about, are there any concerns or pitfalls or like things that you didn't expect might happen that we can learn from that experience?
So sort of is the answer, right? So I had an idea at one point to one of the things I try and do is like humanize researchers, right? So like have it go from like some abstract figure in a lab coat looking into a microscope into three-dimensional humans. And so I remember at one point, basically the answers that you get are not necessarily going to be the answers you expect, right? So like that's what it boils down to, right? And so like there is one person who does like extremely technical work, and when I was doing a piece on like what drives you to do what you do, right? Like I was doing a series of these, and this person was driven to understand like the dynamics of nanomaterials due to their evangelical Christian faith, which was not what I was anticipating in any way, shape, or form. So I don't know that that's a pitfall, but it's just a heads up that you might think you know what the answer is going to be in broad strokes, and you might be wildly wrong.
Yes, I was there last week, so yeah, I get that. Allison, I think you were first.
Sure. Hey, thanks for joining us. Hey, I'm not exactly positive if NC State is like in what is generally defined as the Appalachian region, but you're pretty close. So I'm just, yeah, same with us, kind of. We think of ourselves as in Pittsburgh, Appalachian, but it's not quite defined. Anyhow, I'm just wondering if in communicating with areas that, are maybe more rural and aren't coastal and aren't like giant urban centers, if you've come across any kind of different approaches you might use in storytelling or any kind of more unique, and I don't know if you'd know they're unique since you've been here for a while, but things that maybe you've noticed are different or could be useful for the rest of us who are also in these areas.
Yeah, so NC State's the biggest university in North Carolina, and there are certainly large chunks of North Carolina that are definitely Appalachia, right? And I'm from Virginia originally, so I'm, very sympathetic to Appalachian communities, although I'm not entirely sure that I pronounce it correctly. So perhaps not that sympathetic.
I go back and forth. I don't know. I do my best.
But yeah, so there are a few things, right? So, and these are things that are not necessarily specific to the communities you're talking about, but if you bear them in mind, it will certainly bear fruit when you're talking about these communities. And it's two things, right? So one is meet people where they are, right? In fact, both of them really are meet people where they are. And in the first context, what I mean is, where are they going to get their news, right? So I can speak to North Carolina. There are a bunch of incredibly small newspapers with incredibly small staffs, right? And they are really eager to tell stories that they think that their readers are going to be interested in. So if you've got researchers who are doing work in that space, or if you have researchers who are doing work which is going to be relevant to that population, like for example, if you work at a health research institution, that's going to be stuff which is of interest to humans everywhere, right? So like if you can identify what the major like newspapers are, and I use major sort of in air quotes, I guess, right? Like it might be the biggest newspaper in a county, but it might still have a staff of 2 people. Just make sure that you're reaching out to them, right? That they know what's going on, because they're probably not looking at Eureka Alert or Newswise or whatever. But if you reach out to them individually, then they'll, as a person, right, then they are very likely to be pretty responsive. And my former reporter self is kind of sad about this, but they will often just use what you wrote, right? And it's a great way to reach people in those spaces. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you meet people where they are, which is absolutely do not, under any circumstances, talk down to the people who are reading what you wrote, right? They are not stupid people. They might not know what a particular word means, right? Like they might not know what domain matching epitaxy means, right? But most people don't know what domain matching epitaxy means, and that's fine, right? So it's important to highlight what's interesting or important about the work and how it relates to them. But then I hate the term dumbing it down, right? Because that assumes the other person's dumb. But what I do say is use shared language, right? Talk to them in language that both of you can easily understand. And I frame it that way because the other ways that I've seen it are like, write like you're talking to an 8th grader. And it's like, I'm not talking to an 8th grader, right? I'm talking to a grown-ass man or woman, right? Who maybe doesn't have a PhD in whatever it is, but I'm going to assume that they're pretty bright and they just have a different set of experiences, right? And that is really, really valuable, because if you don't do it that way, right? Or if you be like, it's so obvious that whatever, right? Then you're going to immediately lose them, right? So I don't know how valuable that is, but I think that those are the 2 most important things.
That was great. That's a really good reminder. Thank you.
Yep.
Just as a note, I think I fixed the chat, so you should actually be able to send things in the chat now. Sorry about that. Patrick, I think you were next.
Hey, Matt, I loved the examples of the explainers that you gave. I think they're so fun and creative. Something that I've run into in the past is when I try and pitch a researcher on an idea, like I go to them and I'm like, hey, I think this might be in your wheelhouse. I think this is like a fun thing to talk about. I find that they are like worried about appearing flippant by commenting on something that is like more fun than like serious. And also I run into people who construe their expertise very narrowly in terms of what they're willing to talk about, right? So I'm curious if as you're writing pieces like Do Bugs Fart, you've run into problems like this and how you try and convince people that this is going to be valuable for them.
Yeah, so that's such a good point. So there are a couple pieces to the puzzle here. So one is, not everybody's going to play ball, right? Like if you've got a faculty of, I don't know, however many people, right? There's going to be a subset of that faculty or whatever who are actually going to be game or are interested in this context. And basically you have to frame it as, or I often frame it as, we're sneaking up on them, right? right? We're hiding the vegetables, right? So we're using something that people find fun or entertaining and leveraging that to get them to think about something that they might not otherwise think about, right? So like with fruitcake, you're asking them to think about microbiology. With bug farts, you're also asking them to think about microbiology, but you're asking, like, one of the things that comes up is that, like, there are certain insects that the amount of like gas that they produce, they don't have intestines, but the equivalent of intestinal gas, the simple gut gas, is actually like a significant contributor to climate change. Like, I mean, it's not the biggest piece of the pie by any means, but it is a piece of it's a visible piece of the pie, right? It's a sliver that you can see. So like there are a lot of like meaningful, interesting, valuable things that you can get at by presenting it or framing it in the context of something which is fun or interesting to people outside of the discipline. So that's one thing, right? The other thing is that, like, what I've found is that in addition to finding the right person, they have to be willing to have fun, right? But if you phrase the question the right way, people like to talk about the things that they know a lot about, right? But to get to, just remember the second part of your question, overly construed area of expertise. Yeah, I'm super familiar with that. What I tell people, because it's true, is that you know more about this, like you're an entomologist and you study whatever Katie did. So now I want to ask you about leaf hoppers, which are closely related, I think. Then I'd say, like, you know more about this than 99.9% of people on Earth. And I'm not asking you to be the first author on a review paper about the subject. The level of question that we're talking about, you should be able to answer pretty comfortably, right? If they're still uncomfortable, then fair enough. Okay, right? But I try to like frame it in that context so that say like, hey, we're not saying that you are the world's leading expert on this subject. We're just saying that you know more about it than most people and can answer questions that they might have.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, man.
Someone under RCI Science?
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I can't seem to edit the name. My name's Carrie. I'm the executive director of RCI Science, which is actually based in Canada. So I hope you don't mind me sneaking in, but I saw this on one of the many SciComm mailing lists that I'm part
Welcome.
but I feel a bit cheeky being here. But I was curious if you had any advice for inspiring institutions. So I'm thinking, I don't know what the equivalent terminology is in the States, forgive me, but like deans of faculties of science, like presidents of research and so on and so forth, to think beyond traditional forms of knowledge mobilization and science communication, to inspire them to kind of invest and support their teams to dig a little deeper, to think beyond, you know, publishing in journals, or they make all these niche websites for their research and consider it like doing the work of communication on a great.
Right. Yeah, I'm writing two things down so I don't forget. Please keep talking.
Well, no, that's really it. If you have advice for kind of inspiring them to think beyond impact defined as numbers. So, you know, your press release taking off in the media or getting, you know, a huge traction on social media, to think a little bit more about impact for communities and so on and so forth. Just have you had success with any tactics, that sort of thing?
Right. So like
We're really working on.
right on. Yeah. And so you were more than welcome, right? So I don't think anybody here cares whether you are in a geographic locale that is adjacent to the Appalachian Mountains. So there are three things that popped into my head. I'm sure I'll think of three more like later. But the first one is, you know, administrators, you know, deans, department heads, provosts, whatever one calls them. Do they call chamberlains? Does that sound good? I don't know. It sounds vaguely Canadian. But figure out what's important to them, right? And so like one of the things that's important to them is partnerships, right? So like some unconventional stuff that's out there, like presentations at bars or at museums, that sort of stuff, right? If you frame that as like a partnership, like community partnership, or, you know, like developing relationships with, whatever, look in the thesaurus for synonyms for partner. I can't think of any right now. Then that might be valuable, right? That's less written stuff. It's more like interactive, sort of unconventional stuff, like pub science sort of thing. The second thing, and this one is actually, I think, more relevant to what you were asking and more valuable, learn to speak their language, right? So there's all sorts of terms that I personally am not wild about and have, in fact, over beers made fun of, but, oh, hey, Beth, nice to see you, or not see you. But learn the language that will let you communicate with them, right? So for example, a term that I'm not wild about, but that like academic leadership and research leadership is often very fond of, is they want to be thought leaders, right? So pretty much the only way to be a thought leader is to get out, you can't be a thought leader in a journal article, right? You can only be a thought leader in op-eds or as an expert who's opining on something or whatever. So if you frame this as you're cultivating thought leadership for your research institution, like that's one way to get at it. Let's say you're talking about something that's interdisciplinary in nature and touches on research which is done in different parts of the institution. Then you talk about it as, and this is another term I'm not wild about, but you can talk about it as taking advantage of your institution's research synergies, right? So basically find the catchphrases that are meaningful to the people that you're working for and figure out how do those apply to what we're trying to do, right? So to me, it's like, are you familiar with the phrase backing into the numbers? I can't see you anymore. You are no longer on the screen for me, so I can't tell if you're nodding or whatever, but
I am.
yeah. So like backing into the numbers is where you know what number you want, and then you do the math in such a way as to arrive at the solution that you desire, right? So this is sort of like that. I know what I want to do. How am I going to convince them to let me do it? All right, let's look at the sort of like word soup that seems to be very popular here. What can I use to justify what I want to accomplish, right? And here's the beauty of it, right? Is that usually, like, I've never had to make something up. There always is something there, right? I just need to learn how to capture it in the right sort of admin speak, right? And then the third thing is you were talking about metrics. So I talk about metrics a lot. It's one of my hobby horses. And so there are conventional metrics, which is the easy stuff that you can find like on a dashboard or whatever. But then you can also have what I call unconventional metrics. And these are going to be things that don't show up on a dashboard, but tend to be really valuable. So we're all familiar, for example, with the saying that the plural of anecdote is not data, right? But anecdotes are more powerful than data with individual people, with humans, right? So finding the sort of unconventional metrics that are going to matter to them is really important, right? So I did a piece a long time ago on, it doesn't really matter what it was on. It was on St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It was, whatever, it doesn't matter, but that's what it was about. It was cool. I did it I'd created a blog because this was 2009 and that was cool. And I did this piece on research into St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and it got like, I don't know, 130 views, something like that. Those are the conventional metrics. My boss was very skeptical. Actually, my boss's boss was very skeptical that the blog was going to be a good use of our time. However, that piece, I used it to pitch to a reporter at The Atlantic, and they wrote a feature on this work looking at St. Paul's Cathedral. So if you're looking at conventional metrics, 130 views, right? But if you're looking at what actually is important, how did we raise the visibility of the institution in a meaningful way? Well, we got a feature in the Atlantic. If we're looking at that as a metric, thumbs up, great job, right? So whenever you're doing any sort of communications effort, right, you need to know what you're trying to accomplish, and you need to figure out metrics that are going to measure progress towards that goal in a meaningful way. And it's not necessarily going to be something that can be captured. One of the things that I do there is I follow up with the people that I've worked with, usually about a year after I worked with them, to see, because there are knock-on effects, or there can be. And one of the things I ask is, like, were there any unanticipated effects of our working together, right? If there was a news story, I saw it, right? But what's the stuff I didn't see? Were you, like, did you recruit a grad student or a postdoc who saw the story and reached out to you? Were you contacted by somebody who was interested in collaborating, formally or informally, right? Were there other opportunities, right? Like, so I work at an engineering school. A lot of times I find out that technologies were licensed because people saw news about the work. Multiple times I've had people testify before Congress because of stuff that I wrote, right? Which I wouldn't necessarily have known about. So, like, figure out what those unconventional metrics are going to be for you and capture them, because those can be as meaningful or more meaningful than the numbers that are easy to come by. And wow, that was a long answer. I am very sorry.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Sammy, I think you were next.
Yep.
Yes, that's actually a really good segue to my question, I think, because you mentioned blogs. And I'm interested in, like, what I'm interested in is the distribution part of this. You talk about these wonderful formats, and I'm curious if you're thinking about how you're creating these resources, or how you're framing these resources changes if you're working more towards distribution channels that your institution kind of has direct control over, right? Whether that's social media or email newsletters or whatever that might be. I'm curious if that changes this sort of the source material or how you go about the work.
Yeah, I would imagine that it does, right? So I work at a university, right? And it's very big, and there are lots of different moving parts, and there are communicators at every different level, departments, college, university, whatever. And a lot of them are sort of inward facing, outward facing, mostly inward, right? So they're primarily trying to talk to people who already have some sort of relationship with NC State, right? Alumni, students, parents of students, state legislators, donors, institutional partners or industry partners, all that sort of stuff. And all of that work is, like, super valuable and important and good. And none of that is really what I do, right? So a lot of the stuff that I do is used by people doing that work, but I'm primarily outward facing, right? So I'm trying to talk to people who are interested in the work, period. They may or may not be interested in NC State, but they're going to be interested in this food safety thing because they're interested in food or food safety or whatever, right? So that's how I'm framing it. And if I'm framing it that way, then it will still work if the people are NC State enthusiasts, but it will also work for people that are not NC State enthusiasts. Whereas if I'm framing it in a way that's really Wolfpack specific, Wolfpack, right? Go Pack, then it's only going to be, or it's really going to alienate people that don't give a hoot about NC State, right? So I tend to put, like, sort of the rah stuff on the back burner, but then, like, if NC State's social media team chooses to disseminate it, they're going to do whatever messaging that they want to do when they're writing, you know, the tweet or the LinkedIn post or what have you. But I try to make what I'm writing agnostic, right? And there's also a good time for me to note something I should have said earlier, which is whenever I'm, like, in a Q&A or an explainer or whatever, whenever I'm mentioning the individual, the expert, I'm providing a link to that person's page so that if somebody wants to contact them, they can find their direct contact information very easily. And Anna is very amused at something, and I don't know what, but I'm dying of curiosity.
Don't worry about it. My husband peered over at the little divider. I don't know if any of you saw it, just a little face just popping up.
Oh, I missed it. So yeah, does that answer your question, Sammy?
It does, yes, thank you. That's
Okay.
terrific.
Brilliant, man.
Mark?
Hi, Matt, I hope you forgive me. I actually wanted to just piggyback on something you said for Carrie's, in response to Carrie's thing. It's an example from my own past that I think could be applicable at an academic institutional level. But there was one year when I was given the great privilege to spend the whole year writing stories about the science of the human face. I'm here in Pittsburgh. This was for a newspaper. But at the end of that series, and we covered a whole wide range of things, we put together with some foundation funding a panel at the History Center in the city that featured some of the people who had been, featured in the series. And it was a really interesting group. We had a face transplant recipient. We had somebody who had been born with a facial deformity and was an inspirational speaker. We had a woman who had face blindness and couldn't recognize her own husband by the sight of his face. And these people were put together on a panel. And I think it goes to the point Matt was making about kind of the knock-on effects or the other kinds of metrics, because we probably drew 150 people to that meeting, which was not huge in an urban center. But those people who were in that audience were in many cases thought leaders and people who were very active in the community. And I think the ripple effect from that panel and the discussion, and to be able to see these folks face to face and hear their stories face to face, made an impact. And even though we did it through the instrument of the newspaper, I think institutions can put those kinds of public interest panels together too, and get a ripple effect. So I just wanted to mention that.
Go ahead, Anna.
So I just have a technical question. So as a director, how much writing do you actually do, and how much, how much writing in your day-to-day life would you do?
A lot,
Really?
a
Cool.
lot. And also, I'm kind of the king of nothing mountain, right? So in theory, I oversee 3 writing positions, right? But none of them are filled. So if I don't write it, it don't get written. So that's part of it. But you will also notice that an awful lot of those examples that I put in are not recent, right? So when I had more time to sort of explore these kinds of ideas when I was earlier career, and I took advantage of it. I was very fortunate, and am very fortunate, that my boss really values exploring new approaches to communicating with different audiences effectively. And so basically has given me a lot of rope, right? And so far I've managed to avoid hanging myself with it, but not everything works, but as long as you go in with clearly defined goals and an idea of how to measure whether or not you're making, I hate the term whether or not, so redundant. Let me start over. As long as you have clearly defined goals and have some idea as to how you're going to measure whether you're making progress, see, I did it right that time, then he lets me try pretty much whatever I want, which has been tremendous fun, and is one reason I've been here as long as I've been here. But in pulling together this talk and looking back over this stuff and thinking about it, I really want to do more of this again, because I've found that it's incredibly valuable, both in terms of things that I think are actually important and in things that my boss's boss's boss thinks are actually important, right? So if you were to look, for example, let me back up here and contextualize what I'm going to say. It is not my job, in my view, to get as many clicks as possible on the NC State News website, right? Like that does not serve the institution. That's not an actual strategic goal, right? Getting clicks is just something you can measure. However, some people, think that it's really neat, basically. And there are pieces that I've written, explainers that I've written that pretty much dominate our click count every month and have for years, right? Like I wrote a piece a long time ago on the difference between baking soda and baking powder, largely because I was personally curious about the distinction between baking soda and baking powder. And it gets thousands of views every month because apparently lots of people are going online who also want to know the distinction between baking soda and baking powder, right? And the same for many others, right? When should you replace your cutting board? Stuff like that, right? Like this is stuff that people look up. So it gives me clicks that make my boss's boss happy, right? But then there's stuff which is more valuable from an unconventional metric standpoint, right? The COVID Q&As, those were comfortably I feel that they're the most valuable thing that I've done professionally, period, ever. It is anecdotal because they're individual stories told to me by individual people, the vast majority of whom I did not know and have no relationship to NC State, right? But these were questions that so many people had and that so many people shared with friends and loved ones who were anxious about getting vaccinated or whatever. And these people contacted me. A handful kind of creepily found my personal phone number. I don't know how, and called me. And like some of them were really upset and I just had to talk to them. Some of them were really grateful, but it was like a really powerful experience. And I know that I touched these people's lives in a very real way. So both in terms of the stuff that makes administrators happy and the stuff that makes me feel like a valuable member of society, like it's been great. I have no idea if that answered your question. I hope it did.
It did. Thank you.
Yeah. Allison?
Thanks. I'm taking a hard turn from that, which was, a really nice explanation
Let's get
to
silly again.
AI chatbots. What is your stance on them, I guess? And what are you seeing if you had a crystal ball? What are your ideas?
Okay.
Specifically when it comes to communication about perhaps science stuff or even just institutional announcements and the media.
Okay, so the long answer is in the chat. There's a lot of people had questions about generative AI, and I was also seeing a lot of stuff that was like not correct out there on generative AI. So I pulled together this, which is basically, it's kind of like a precise. Am I saying that word correctly? That's a word that I know from reading, not from talking. So I'm not sure if it's pronounced correctly. But I pulled together what I hope is a relatively concise overview of some of the challenges that exist with these technologies as they currently exist. I think that they can have utility, right? But I think that that utility is somewhat limited and really needs to be, I'm not sure what the word is. It really needs to be contained. Like you really need to build a fence around it, right? And there are a lot of reasons for this, right? There are legal liability issues, right? There are so for example, if you're creating, and again, a word I'm not crazy about using when we're talking about writing, but if you're generating content, right, for a website or for a pamphlet or for a brochure or for something that's going to be public facing and where you're going to want to preserve the IP on whatever you're putting out into the world, right? You better not be using generative AI because you cannot secure IP for anything that was made using generative AI, right? That's a legal precedent that's set. We already have that, even though it's only been out for 2 years, right? So that's remarkable. And a lot of people don't know it. There are also potential like trademark and copyright liability issues that remain to be seen. Then there's a ton of reputational liability issues, right? So everybody, I think most people at least are somewhat familiar with hallucinations. They're really very common. They're not an anomaly. And also there's a concept called AI drift, which, to vastly oversimplify, basically means that AI gets dumber over time, or that generative AI will get dumber over time. There's a euphemism for explaining how that happens, but I'm not going to say it because it's very coarse. I don't want to offend, but it's bad. So essentially, if you're going to be using it for anything that is going to be even remotely public facing, you need to be extremely careful. You need to fact check everything that's in there twice. And the thing is, like right now, if you have a competent writer on staff, it is going to be more like cost effective and time effective to simply get them to write it. Now, if you don't have a competent writer on staff, then you're very welcome, Sarah. I hope this was valuable for you. If you don't have a competent writer on staff, then I guess you can use it, but triple check everything in every fact in there. And you can't use it to fact check for you, right? Which a lot of people do. So like I know people who have asked it to provide citations. It will absolutely provide citations. And by it, I mean they, right? Like any of the text generating tools. But the citations themselves are often made up to the point where there's a term for it. It's called hallucitation, get it? And yeah, it's deeply problematic. If you're going to be doing anything that's related to anything that needs to be kept private or secure, right? Whether that's health records or proprietary information for technologies that you're trying to protect IP on or whatever, you really don't want to use it. There are already cases of companies that have used it, and the text generator, the AI, is like gobbled up the input and then spat it back out for somebody else at a completely different organization. So for fun read, look up Samsung and ChatGPT. Good times ahead. So like, these are not purely hypothetical concerns. They're concerns that we already have evidence of, or rather problems that we already have evidence of. And I think it's really important that if people are going to use these tools, and as I said, I think there can be value, then you need to know what the limitations and potential challenges are. Shortly put, like, I'm not worried about my job being taken away anytime soon.
Thank you.
And Matt, I don't think the link appeared in the chat, or at least not for everyone. So
Yep.
you
Hang
might
on,
want
let me try
to
again.
put it again.
Everyone in meeting. There we go. There.
Okay, there we go. Awesome. We don't really have time for another question, but if someone has like the last question of the day that they want to ask, go ahead.
Come on, we're all communicators. We're curious people. I'm sure somebody has a question. Hit me.
I mean, I can ask one more question that might be a good one to send us off to a good afternoon, evening. And this is moving again in a little bit of a different direction, but someone was wondering, what kinds of things do you think, since you've been in this SciComm world for a while, what do you think younger science writers are most in need of in terms of expertise and support?
Well, okay. So here's what I would say to that. I don't know that it's changed, for one thing, right? So I think what everybody needs who's early career or is interested in getting into this field is twofold, right? So, and I'm going to write the second one down so that I don't forget it while I'm talking about the first one. is one, you need to be edited. You need good editing, right? A good editor is not just going to tell you what's wrong. They're going to tell you like why. They're going to ask you a million questions, right? They're going to make you sort of interrogate what you've done, right? And why you did it. And help you like write more clearly and more engagingly, and how to like help you think about your audience, right? So getting edited is it, right? Like, I think that that's never going to change, right? Like fundamentally, we're telling stories, right? And we need to get people's attention and hold it and communicate clearly and effectively and honestly and responsibly. And the way to get better at doing all of those things is to work with somebody who's really thinking critically and can provide an outside perspective and help you improve in that skill set, right? And that's going to be true forever, right? Even as the tools that we're using to do that communicating change. We're still telling stories. We're just using different tools to tell stories, right? So which brings me to the second thing, right? Which I touched on before. And this is unfortunately not limited to early career people, but like if somebody's been doing this job for a while and they've like have some experiences and they've learned from those experiences over time, right? What we need to cultivate, all of us, right, is critical thinking. And it's always been important, it's always been valuable, but as new tools are created, it is becoming more important and more valuable, right? So like the AI tools, the generative AI tools are a really good example of this, right? Because if we're not thinking critically about how we use them, we're going to misuse them, right? And so I'd said that there are ways that they can be useful. Like I'll give you an example, right? So like sometimes you're not sure how to start, or you're not sure how to transition between paragraphs, right? And what I've found very often is that it is easier to fix something bad than it is to create something from whole cloth, right? I use this a lot when I'm working with researchers. If I don't really understand what they're doing, I will like make some, I almost cursed, but I didn't, I caught myself. I will make some stuff up and I'll say, is this right? And they'll be like, no, it's not that, it's this, right? And it's much easier if I say, well, what is this? Then they start like, well, first the earth cooled and then the dinosaurs came. Like, no, too much. Is it this? No, it's not this, it's that. Great. So you can do a similar thing. Like I know people who have done similar things with like ChatGPT or whatever, and they'll get 3 leads and all of them will be awful, right? But by seeing 3 awful leads, they'll have a pretty good idea of what a good lead would be, right? And so, so like that's a way to use it that actually kind of makes sense. Like, okay, I get that. I can dig it. But where you run into problems is when you're not thinking critically about, well, where did this stuff come from? Right? Or if you assume that the information that's in what was written is correct without fact checking it, right? That's dangerous business. Like image generation is even more dangerous, right? So you might say, okay, I'm doing a piece on something from my business school. I want a picture of a CEO, or I want a picture of a whatever, the corporate board or whatever. And if you do that, like show me a leader, then you're almost certainly going to get a picture of a white guy, probably an older white guy, right? And that's messed up, right? But if you're not thinking about it, you'll be like, all right, yep, that guy looks like a CEO, whatever, right? Then you're perpetrating a problem rather than being part of the solution, right? So you need to be thinking critically about your tools. And that was true when blogs came along. Like people just would create blogs and like spend a lot of time writing on them and nobody would ever see them, right? It was just a wasted time. But blogs can be valuable if you use them in a way that's useful, right? If you're thinking critically about it. Same for social media, right? Like I joined Twitter like the same year that it started, and I was able to get value out of it, but it's not valuable for everybody. It depends on how you use it, right? So teaching people to think critically about their work about the tools that they're using, I think is as important now as it ever was, and may potentially be more important as we are being given more powerful tools that relate to storytelling that are also potentially vastly more problematic.
Thank you. I think that's a good point for us to wrap up.
Kind of a bummer. Sorry, guys. Ended on a down note.
It's a bummer, but it's also something that all of us are able to help others with. So I think that's a good way to help move forward from something that, yeah, sometimes it's a hard choice of career, but it's also real fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody, you'll get my notes for what they're worth.
Yes,
We'll send
we
out
will be.
notes. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
Well, I was just going to say that we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered, and hopefully we've been hearing that people have been getting like some bounce backs, or emails been getting into the spam folder. So maybe check your spam folder. But we'll try to send it out soon. And yeah, Christina, if you want to say a few more words.
If you enjoyed today, AppSciComm.org is where you sign up for our email list. Again, we do not spam. I'm really picky about that, and so is everybody else on the board. But we are continuing this series, so keep an eye out for other announcements. But thank you all for coming on a random Tuesday. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Matt. That was a really good presentation.
Yeah, no problem.
Everyone.
And Brandy, yes, the answer is yes. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.